The history of psychiatric hospitals throughout the world is pretty bleak. Patients were often admitted for minor reasons and then spent the rest of their lives inside the hospital walls. During the early days of mental health care, electroshock therapy and lobotomies were common practice and usually done without anesthetic. It's no surprise, then, that, much like the terrifying haunted asylums around the world, so many of the creepy abandoned hospitals around the world are now hotspots for paranormal activity. One hospital took such bad care of its patients that a woman went missing inside only to be found dead in the basement 42 days later. Read on for more chilling stories about the world's most terrifying haunted hospitals. Hey folks, before we start with today's stories, remember to subscribe as it really helps the channel. Cone Memorial Hospital was opened in 1830 in response to a smallpox outbreak. It later tended to Civil War soldiers and lost several staff members during the yellow fever outbreak in 1878. The hospital remained open until 1989. It was boarded up by the 1990s, but several paranormal investigation teams have made it inside. There have been reports of full-body apparitions and shadow figures creeping through the halls. In 2015, a team of paranormal investigators discovered the dead body of a missing woman inside Cone. She appeared to have been murdered. In 1940, the remains of an estate called Knockton Hall were converted into a hospital for the Royal Air Force. It was later expanded to become a general hospital and officially opened in 1947. It was in operation until 1995. Back when Knockton Hall was a home, it was said to be haunted by the ghost of a young servant girl who had been murdered by the owner's son after he got her pregnant. Her spirit would appear sobbing at the foot of beds, talking about a devilish man who had done this to her. A grey lady has also been spotted roaming the halls. Old Changi Hospital was built in 1935 and is now known as one of the most haunted places in Singapore. It was originally used by the Royal Air Force and later became a Japanese prison camp and torture chamber. It closed in 1997 and since then has been investigated for paranormal activity. Visitors report strange noises, feelings of nausea, and the sensation that something followed them outside of the building. Although it was mostly abandoned in 1985, Lea Psychehus is still partially operational. It's home to patients who live side by side with ghosts and report lots of strange noises and shadows. Conditions are most likely better now, but from 1945 to 1974, the hospital had a reputation for experimenting on patients. Lea Psychehus offered up its residents for drug tests that pharmaceutical companies were hesitant to perform on humans. The Alton Mental Health Center is still operational and not open for paranormal investigations, but some creepy stories have made their way to the outside world. The hospital, which is a series of buildings connected by tunnels, opened in 1916. Patients were subjected to lobotomies and electroshock therapy. Today, many patients and staff report hearing voices throughout the hospital and in the tunnels. A nurse working in a secluded part of the building once heard a man behind her ask, "Who's that?" She responded, but nobody was there. The same exact thing happened to another nurse later that night. Rumors of mysterious deaths and a sudden closure in the 1990s make Gonjiam Hospital one of South Korea's most haunted locations. Legend has it that patients and staff would suddenly die and be found later in their beds or at their desks. It's possible that a doctor on staff was mentally ill and he was the one responsible for all of the deaths. Whatever the reason for the closure, there's no doubt that some bad energy was left behind. People who visit often run screaming from the building after seeing shadows, hearing moans, and feeling the scratch of invisible fingernails on their skin. Penhurst State School and Hospital was built in 1908 as a state school for the physically and mentally disabled. It was enormous and housed more than 10,000 students at a time. The facility quickly gained a bad reputation after several residents came forward with reports of neglect and abuse. The building was shut down in 1986, and everything in it was left behind, including medical equipment and patients' belongings. Paranormal activity has been reported from the abandoned hospital, including voices, strange footsteps, and items being hurled across the room. Take a peek inside with the Ghost Finders investigative team to see for yourself. Poveglia Island, where the soil is equal parts dirt and human remains, has a long history with death and dying in Italy. During the bubonic plague in the 14th century, the infected were shipped to the small island between Venice and Lido to live out the rest of their miserable days. From that time on, any time a mass infection came around, the dead and half-dead alike were dumped there to smolder in mass graves. And, if that's not enough, a mental hospital was erected on the island in the 1920s. Now, the island is plagued by angry, restless ghosts, including that of a doctor who, by suicide or murder, fell to his death from the bell tower. Italians avoid the island, well, like the plague. Built in 1891, Sai Ying Pun was originally used for nurses' housing until World War II. The building was badly damaged by fires, but the facade remains. It is now the site of an apartment complex. Also known as the High Street Ghost House, Sai Ying Pun has no shortage of paranormal activity. Two of the most common sightings are a headless ghost who runs through the halls and a demonic man dressed in traditional Chinese garb. He usually bursts into flames on the second floor. Severals Hospital opened in 1913 and housed up to 2,000 patients at a time. Countless residents were experimented on there in the early days of mental health care before the hospital was shut down in 1997. Sometimes patients received full frontal lobotomies just for being moody. Today, Severals is decaying but remains standing. Ghost hunters who have visited are particularly drawn to the mortuary. St. Bartholomew's is the oldest hospital in London, dating back to 1123. It's still operational today. Inside, there is an elevator known as the coffin lift, which sometimes takes passengers to the basement all on its own. Once down there, the lights go out, and the elevator won't move. The passenger is usually forced to pull open the gated doors and walk back upstairs, and the entire time, there is the sensation that the elevator is following up each level. It's usually waiting on the main floor, doors open and lights on when the passenger arrives. Rumor has it that the ghost of a nurse who was murdered by a deranged patient in the basement is having a little fun with her fellow nurses. Operating from 1854 to 1975, the Taunton State Hospital was originally known as the State Lunatic Hospital at Taunton. While it was open, Taunton was home to some pretty well-known criminals. Jane Topham was a nurse who was sent there after experimenting on her patients with morphine and atropine. She would send them to the brink of death with one injection and back to life with another, until she got tired of it and finally killed her victim. Lizzie Borden also spent some time inside the walls of Taunton. During the 1920s, residents reported witnessing a group of doctors bringing patients down into the basement. Those patients were never seen again.